Olá, sejam muito bem-vindos a mais uma live pesadíssima e de muito respeito do Brasil Fantasy Football, BRFF, o seu canal de fantasy no Brasil. Eu sou André Amaral e hoje estaremos na companhia de Jordan Mcnamara, um dos maiores nomes em analytics de fantasy football no mundo, redator no Football Guys, criador do site Analytics of Dynasty e autor do livro homônimo. Já deixando claro que essa live será legendada daqui a alguns dias, eu passarei alguns recados bem legais, depois faremos a dinâmica com o Jordan toda em inglês, para não ficar muito travada, beleza, pessoal? Mas fica com a gente, mesmo se o seu inglês não for 100% fluente, porque vale muito a pena e você ainda terá a chance de concorrer a 2 vagas no nosso BRF Bowl, o Scott Fishbowl brasileiro, que reúne diversos perfis brasileiros da NFL e contribui com as obras sociais Irmã Dulce, ao final do programa vai rolar esse sorteio. Well, good evening, Jordan. Thank you very much for being here with us. It's truly an honor to welcome one of the biggest names in the fantasy football industry.
Thanks for having me. I don't know if I'd put myself there, but thanks for having me. I really appreciate being on and joining you guys.
Oh, you sure put yourself in it. There's no doubt about it. Well, before we start, I'll just send some messages in Portuguese to the audience and introduce my fellow colleagues so they can say their greetings to you and those watching us, okay?
Sure.
Então, galera, convidar vocês para participar com perguntas e comentários, cornetados, o que vocês quiserem, como sempre aqui no chat. Curtam o vídeo, se inscrevam no canal. Ó, tem que estar aqui inscrito no canal, seguindo o nosso perfil no Twitter e o do Brasil Dynasty, que é o @BrasilDynastyFF no Twitter, para participar do sorteio ao final, e também tem que mandar pergunta aqui, comentário, então interage bastante aí com a gente. Bom, tem também o convite para vocês assinarem o BRFF pelo site, a gente tem as opções de plano anual e semestral. No anual você ganha a segunda edição do livro do Fantasy Football, além de mentoria com a nossa equipe, e no plano semestral, assim como no anual, tem acesso exclusivo ou antecipado a artigos especiais e o Draft Kit. Lembrando que o site está oferecendo 7 dias de teste grátis, hein, gente? E você que joga fantasy e vê as ligas internacionais com prêmios, mas por aqui não encontrava essa opção, pois sabe que chegou. É o Big Ball Fantasy Leagues. Agora você pode jogar a sua liga com prêmios no Brasil. No bigballfl.com você encontra ligas Best Ball, ligas de temporada, né, Season Long, Redraft e até mesmo de Dynasty. Todas com prêmio ao final. O que você está esperando para se juntar a uma galera e se divertir ganhando prêmios em ligas de fantasy? bigballfl.com, o maior site de bolão de ligas de fantasy no Brasil. Bom, apresentar aqui meus colegas de bancada, para eles darem o salve, o recado inicial para a galera e para o Jordan. Começando pelo nosso grande editor-chefe, o rei das analytics no Brasil, meu grande amigo Rui Maurício. Tudo bom, chefia?
Tudo bom, André? E aí, galera? Hey, Jordan, it's an honor to meet you in person, although by distance. Me as an enthusiast of analytics, I'm thrilled and I'm very happy to have you here.
It's totally my pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you.
Nice. Também aqui com a gente, o glorioso produtor da equipe, que agora voltou a me salvar aqui na pilotagem do StreamYard, meu grande amigo Sérgio Luiz. Beleza, cara?
Fala aí, André. Fala aí, Rui, Caio. Hi, Jordan. Thank you for coming here. It will be a pleasure to talk to you tonight.
My pleasure.
Nice. E para encerrar a equipe aqui, Caio Bretas, meu grande amigo, já estivemos juntos hoje e hoje novamente como meu co-host. Valeu pela presença, Caião.
Hello, Sérgio. Hello, André. Hello, Rui. And hello, Jordan. I'm truly excited to have you here tonight. I'm sure we'll have an awesome show. Let's go.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it, shall we? Jordan, to begin with, how did you begin playing fantasy football and then studying analytics deeply? Tell us your trajectory in the fantasy football world, please.
Yeah, that's a good, real good question. I think I've been playing fantasy football it's probably been about 25 years. I started when I was like 1996, 97, 98, somewhere in that range. I played in a home league with my dad. We co-owned a team actually until I went to college, I think even further than that. Like we were together on a team for a really long time, in this home league that I was in. So I took it really seriously, and it was great. And so as I sort of went through school or whatever, I kept playing in the league. I played in a couple other ones. I never really got super into Dynasty, even though that league was a keeper. We kept, I think, 7 guys. I think we keep 7 guys now. We kept more at one point, and it kind of reduced down. I got introduced to Dynasty when I was I had graduated from school, and I was living in my grandmother's basement waiting tables, not using my degree. And I needed something to do. And so I was like, I'm going to start playing fantasy football. And so I started playing Dynasty. And then, that would have been 2012. And then one league turned into 2 leagues, turned into 4 leagues. And I'm like the exponential growth Dynasty guy. And so now I'm in like 30 leagues or something like that. And I got more into analytics, I would say, probably in the last like 5-6 years, something like that. I was just really analytics driven for a while, fantasy baseball and some other, looking at some other things. But I was really able to adapt analytics to fantasy football over the past like 5 years. And it's really been helpful to my arc as a Dynasty owner, just to understand, analytics can be a big buzzword. It can be a big, intimidating word, but I think a lot of it is just understanding expectations. And if you sort of understand what you're expecting out of players, and what you're, the cost of what you're paying for players, I think it can really help you be better. And so, understanding that the difference between someone drafted in the first round and someone drafted in the second round is pretty massive depending on the position you are in. You know what I mean? So those sorts of things have been really, really helpful, and that's really been my arc. And then, I'm on book number 3, and I've got the Analytics of Dynasty website. So that's kind of been my arc as a Dynasty player into being a Dynasty analyst, if you will.
Yeah, man, awesome arc. And continuing the questions, which are the most important data or stats of a player to be looked at, and how do they influence a player's outlook?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think, like, if you were to just tell me, I think there's a couple of things that you could look at. Guys coming into the NFL. So if you're looking at guys that have already, the rookies, for example, guys that are going to be in the NFL draft and are going to be your rookie picks. I think the position that they play and the round they went in the NFL draft, like if you know just those things, right, you can do pretty well just knowing that, and just sort of drafting based off that. For if you're in a startup draft, or if you're looking for, some individual player analysis, I do think that ADP, or average draft position, done right, is pretty helpful. I think the market's pretty efficient in terms of giving you an idea of what a player's worth. I definitely think that that's true. It's got to be done right though, and you want it from real drafts, and not just a couple of mock drafts. Like you want to get a real understanding of what people are doing when they're drafting. So that's one thing that I would look at. And then the other thing I think is really important is, depending on the position, what a player has done. And because the guys who have done it versus the guys who have not done it, their arcs are massively different. Right. So if you're looking at a guy who hasn't really, I consider, I sort of use that as shorthand. I consider it whether a guy's been a fantasy starter or not. So if a quarterback's been a top 12 quarterback, if a tight end's been a top 12 tight end, and if running backs or wide receivers have finished in the top 12 of their position, they have shown to produce better than guys who have not done that at the same cost. So I think that's a big deal. And I think age, you have to balance age in there. I think different positions matter differently. And as I sort of play more and more Dynasty and study it more, I play each position a little bit differently. And I think that's a lot of age and experience and those things. I care less about at quarterback in terms of, like, I'll draft a 34-year-old quarterback and feel totally fine about it. Whereas I don't really want to get into, 31-year-old running backs, for example. I'd much rather go younger. I'm fine drafting older wide receivers and tight ends, for example, too, because that's more of an experience position, a more production position than it is necessarily a youth position. So I think understanding those, and then ultimately trying to figure out what you're trying to accomplish. I think And it's interesting because I watched the Tour de France, and I'm a pretty big cycling fan, and each team's competing to do something different, right? Like they're all in a race for 21 days over 21 out of 23 days. They're all racing, right? And they're all sort of riding in the same race, but they're all competing in different ways. Some guys want to win a stage. Some guys want to win intermediate portions of a stage. Some guys want to win the entire race. I think kind of understanding what your aim is in terms of how you're playing is a huge deal, right? If you're trying to build a really valuable roster to trade with, the type of players that you're going to want to have on your roster totally different than what you might want to have if you're trying to win this year. So I think balancing those things and really making a decision about what you want to do strategically is a big deal.
Yeah. In these lines as well, which abilities should someone have, or at least would help them to begin studying analytics, maybe different careers or points of study? For example, I'm a man of humanities. I'm a lawyer. I don't know if someone who is an engineer, for example, have a little more advantage on this field of analytics.
Yeah, I'm a lawyer by trade too. So
nice.
And I my dad was a math major, and he's totally embarrassed by the fact that I'm in analytics because I essentially failed out of calculus when I was in high school. So that's kind of how far I got with formal mathematics education. So I don't make it, needless to say, I don't make it super complicated. And that's kind of the beauty of how I write it, is it's not meant to be super complicated. I think, and for a while, and I actually still do it on the website as part of, we can get together for a strategy session. It's a service that I offer for people. And I always ask people, what do you do for a living? Because it's so fascinating. And the one thing that I've learned as I've sort of talked more and more to people, what they do for a living and sort of who they are is a lot about how they play Dynasty. And for me, that means I'm really able to understand hey, here's what a player's worth. Here's what I'm willing to sort of sell him for. Here's the risk that I'm taking with this player. And here's what I'm comfortable with. A guy who is a college scout, right? Or I have a subscriber who's a basketball coach. He looks at the world a little bit differently than I do, right? He looks at the world much more through a film base, just because that's kind of how he sees the world. And that's not to say that I'm right or he's right, or that I'm wrong or he's wrong, but I think it does shape how we make decisions. And I think that's why it's important to have a variety of different, inputs into your process. There's a lot of analytics people that don't want anything to do with film. There's a lot of film people that don't want anything to do with analytics. I think if you do that, you're sort of, there's portions of me being a lawyer that make me totally dead to what other people are thinking. And if I'm not sort of intaking that information, I'm probably missing it. So I do think there's different things that we have to understand that are our strengths and that are our weaknesses, and sort of understand that and be open to what's different.
Great, man. I once saw you retweeting a guy who said that all his teams would suck if Kyle Pitts were a bust, because, he had a lot of Kyle Pitts shares.
Yeah.
And you retweeted the guy and you said, and I quote, "Don't worry, we overstay the value of one player in our teams." And
Right.
So I ask you, how to properly value quantity versus quality of players in Dynasty? Those typical 2-for-1 trades, how should we look at them?
It's a really good question. So when I started playing, this was back to kind of what I said earlier about how you have to kind of understand what your expectations are. And that's so much about why I think analytics is important, is because, what's a 5th round pick really mean? What's success look like for that, right? If you get one starter season out of that player, is that good or is that bad, right? And that's a lot of the questions that I set out to answer. So one of in the pursuit of that, I developed a metric called wins over replacement player, or what I call WARP. And it's it's stolen from baseball. And it's basically, you just look at what a player compares to their peers at the position and what a replacement level would be. So for example, at tight end in a normal league, I use the replacement level of tight end 18 each week. All right. So I just go through and I take, whatever the tight end 18 is. And usually I think it's like somewhere in the range of like 5 to 8 points is typically somewhere in the range of where tight end 18 is, if memory serves. And I just take that number and subtract it from whatever the player scores. So if Travis Kelce scores 35 points and tight end 18 scored 10, right, he's 25 points over a replacement player. And then I just add that up over the course of a 13-game regular season, and I get a WARP number, which tells me basically how many that tells me how many points over replacement I am. And then WARP is basically, it depends on the nature of your league. So in Superflex leagues, you just divide your points over replacement by 110, which is basically what a win is worth. Each 110 points that you increase your team's total score over the course of the regular season is an extra win. And so in a start one quarterback league, it's usually about 97 is what my research has found. And so you just divide that and it tells you what the number is, right? So if typically, right, in the greatest tight end season of all time, right, like Kyle Pitts or whoever that tight end is, like Kelce last year, right? He's probably somewhere in the range of like between 1.5 and 2 wins over a replacement player, which is outstanding, right? That's really good. That's up in the elites of the guys that do it. You might get a couple of running backs that go for like 2. Right? I think the highest number that I've ever seen is 2.6, and that's extremely high. That was like the McCaffrey year a couple of years ago. But like anything over 1.25, like that's really good. But what you're not seeing, right? Then what I'm not saying is the numbers like 5, right? Which I think is what a lot of people think. Like what I interpreted that guy to say was like, oh, if Kyle Pitts isn't good, he's going to cost me like 4 or 5 wins. He's not. Like he's not. Like you're going to find someone to replace him, and it might cost you a win, right? And so that's one thing I sort of look at, and I think understanding those differences, and that's great for trades, right? How do you evaluate the 2 for 1? Well, you can just sort of look at it in a WARP concept and say like, all right, like I know that, if I can improve my starting lineup by 25 points over the course of a season, like that's about a quarter of a win. Right? That's pretty good in terms of what a trade could offer me, right? And then I think the flip side of that's equally important, right? Like, hey, if I'm making a deal and it's going to cost me, maybe a point a week, right? That's probably not going to hurt me that much. But what's the other asset that I'm getting back? If I'm getting a future first-round pick in that deal, right? That's something that can move. That's something that can be a multiple win type scenario. That can be a really big deal. So evaluating those things through the lens of wins over replacement player, like that's been hugely impactful in terms of how I look at the world and able to see players and understanding that even when we make mistakes, right, it's okay, right? It doesn't tank our team. And and the flip side of that too is if you're relying on Kyle Pitts to come in and make a huge difference, he's probably not changing the trajectory of your dynasty team. If your dynasty team was, 5-8 last year, like the odds that Kyle Pitts makes you a playoff team, it's pretty remote, right? So you have to look for other places to sort of get better too. And it's not just a one-player solution type situation.
Yeah, that's awesome. Just before our next question, giving a shout out to the audience, to the ones who are participating: Marilene Rocha, Sergio Loss, our great friend Fernando Timbó, and Derek Bissigini, who sent us a question. Keep sending them, guys. It's very important for us. And well, our next question is this one. One of the most talked about aspects in fantasy football is regression to the mean. How do you view it, and how important it is?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think regression to the mean is basically you look for stats that aren't particularly sticky year over year, right? And so one of the big ones, right, one of the easiest ones is touchdown rate, because touchdowns are such a big portion of what the score is of a player, right? It can make, if you get lucky, right? If you get lucky and score, 4 or 5 more touchdowns than you would otherwise expect just because of some fluky stuff, your touchdown rate's going to look pretty good and your numbers are going to be pretty inflated. And that's a big deal. So when you look at, for example, like a couple of years ago, when Lamar Jackson had his MVP season, what he did was he basically ran a ton. He didn't really throw all that well, but 9% of his passing attempts were touchdowns. Right? That's just an enormous. Right? That's, I mean, not to get super geeky here, but that's like 3 standard deviations over the average, which is a huge outlier, right? And then you sort of look at that, and on average, that's about 4.5, right? That's about the average touchdown rate in the NFL over the past, I think it's 4.5, 4.6 over the past 20 years. That's about what it is, and it hasn't really gone up. And you see it year over year, it's not that predictive of what happens the next year. So right, there's a ton of randomness in it. And we see this in games every week, right? Guy falls down, A.J. Brown breaks an 85-yard touchdown because this guy falls down, right? Like, that's good luck, right? That's for the Ryan Tannehill who threw the pass, like, that's really good luck. And, those things break your way one year, and then the next year they don't. And then it sort of breaks, that's how you sort of get back to, you regress to your mean. So what I usually do is when those situations come, the other really important one is, so that touchdown rate at all the positions is really important. The other one is points per target for wide receivers is a huge regression stat. So last year was a really good example. DK Metcalf was like pushing like the high 2s, which is just absolutely astronomical and not repeatable. And even the great ones don't get that high, right? They just can't hold up that, because that's just it's really, really lucky. And what happens is you see usually guys in the somewhere between 1.8 and 1.6 is usually right around where it falls, and that is pretty random year over year, right? So if you're really good one season, it doesn't say very much about what we're going to do the next season. And so seeing those guys that are really, really high, right, that's something that you can expect to basically come back down to earth. And the flip side of that is guys that are really low. Like a couple of years ago, DeAndre Hopkins had a huge season in terms of targets. He had 151 targets, but he had just an incredibly inefficient year. People were writing his demise and all of those things. He finished, I think it's been like one of the only years he's ever finished outside the top 24. And just things didn't break his way. And the next season, he had about the same amount of targets, and he had his points per target were something like 1.85. And when you sort of average them out over the course of a year, it was right at the average, which was 1.6, 1.65, and that was his wide receiver one's finish. Right. So those things are super fluky year over year, sort of understanding that, and then don't pay for it when the person's expecting negative regression, and buy low when you're expecting positive regression.
Nice. Now let's talk about something that always happens season to season, and it's more of a news side, a factual side of the league. Do you follow coaching changes in the NFL and adjust to them? How does this affect projections in a general matter?
That's a really, really good question. So yeah, I follow it. I don't think that we are particularly good at predicting what's going to happen. There's so much fluky stuff. There's so much variance. And we're only privy to a very, very small amount of information. So when you think about, we see 16 games. Now we'll see 17 games, and we see these guys for 4 hours a week, and you get 17 games, right? You sort of add that up, and then you think about how much of the year that is. It's a minuscule amount of the year. Right? I mean, it's a very, very small amount of their lives that we see. And that's the same with coaching, right? It's the same with all these guys. The decisions that they make, we only see a fraction of them, and so there's so much in there that we don't see. So it's can be really tough to understand, what's going on. And so that's the thing with coaching, right? There's a lot of things that we can look at and say, hey, like, here's kind of what we think should probably happen, and then we'll see decisions all the time from coaches that don't make sense to us, because we're dealing with incomplete information. They're looking at the full deck of cards. We're looking at one card, trying to draw inferences from it. And so that's, I think you have to be careful in terms of, making a huge projection based off of coaching change. One thing that, for example, I think Arthur Smith, the new head coach in Atlanta, who was the offensive coordinator in Tennessee, I think he's a really, really good coach, right? I think he's a really good offensive coach. That said, I'm not sure how he's going to impact Tennessee, or excuse me, how he's going to impact Atlanta, because he was gifted a couple of really good things, right? He benefited from Derrick Henry being a cyborg, and he benefited from Ryan Tannehill being like extremely better than he ever was in his entire career. Are those things that he made? Are those things that he adapted to? Which is to say that, like, in a normal world, he would be a little bit more throw happy, right? In a normal world, he would throw the ball a lot more, but because of the hand that he was sort of given, he played it a different way, right? I don't know what the answer to that question is, right? I think he's a really good offensive coach. I'm not sure what his DNA is, right? Is his DNA, because the talent in Atlanta looks a lot different than what the talent in Tennessee looks like. I think Matt Ryan's probably a better quarterback than Ryan Tannehill is. I think Calvin Ridley is a very good wide receiver. He's different than A.J. Brown, but he's very good, right? They're just different players, right? Mike Davis, who I project to sort of be their starting running back, I think is really good. And he catches the ball really well for his size. He is not Derrick Henry, right? But he does stuff that's significantly worse than Derrick Henry. Right? He's not the power back that Derrick Henry is, but he does stuff a lot better than Derrick Henry does, which is catch the ball. So how does that sort of change? Those are all things that I think, I sort of look at these things and like, hey, what are the questions that we don't know? And then sort of how can we figure out answers to those, or how do we look at clues? And I wrote an article over at Football Guys that should be coming out soon, and it's basically 32 questions, right? And a lot of them are about, it's one about each team, and a lot of them is about the coaching adjustments, and that Atlanta one's a good example. So I think coaching is really important. I think understanding and predicting it, we can struggle with just because we don't have the full deck of cards to look at.
Interesting. I'd like to encourage our public to ask some questions in the chat, because we do the public questions section in our show, and we'd like to have more of it. And one question from the public is from Derek, and he asks, Jordan, if you have to pick between two players that are quite similar in a Dynasty league, what's the first or most important KPI that you look at as a tiebreaker?
Yeah, I guess it's the position that they play, their prior production, their cost, other things that I would sort of look at. If they're very, very similar, which one can I get later is an interesting one to look at. Those are the types of things that I look at. And then understanding too that, again, it's really tough to pick between players. Like it's really, and as I sort of study more of this, I think it's really, really hard to sort of pick between guys. And so trying to figure out a way to, let someone else do it, right? Trade down, right? If there's two guys that are really close to you and you think you can get one, a couple rounds later or something like that, do that. In a trade, for example, if there's a couple guys that look the same to you, but one's going a lot more expensive than the other one, right? Trade for the guy that's cheaper and sort of get the other one, because then you're letting the other person make the decision on what you think's pretty close, and you're collecting a profit off of it, right? Those are the types of things that I think, that's what when I see two guys that look the same, that's usually my first reaction, and the analytics at Dynasty at the website as part of the subscription, I do tiers. And it's identifying specifically that here are guys that look the same, and how do we figure out a way to make a move from player A to player B, for example, Devontae Adams to Keenan Allen, right? Those guys look pretty similar in terms of some of their stats, in terms of some of their profiles, how they project going forward. It's a pretty big gap there in terms of their cost, right? Adams is more expensive than Allen. How do I sort of trade Adams for Allen plus?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Another question that I have is about Superflex. How do you approach it? Are you more of a two elite guys, of a one elite guy, or two medium guys?
Yeah. Yeah. So, Superflex, I think it really matters. I think in Superflex, what you're really trying to do, the best quarterbacks in Superflex are the quarterbacks that have already done it, right? And typically, what I say is like the easiest way to sort of identify who's already done it is guys that have hit twice, who've had 2 starter seasons in their career. And because those guys, the arc that they're on is significantly higher than guys that have hit once, and it's significantly higher than guys that have hit 0 times. And you just sort of look at that. It's a much higher level of certainty, and you just know a lot more about them, and it's a lot more safety. So that's the first place that I start. Is I sort of narrow the board to, I'm not going to be, if there's a decision between a guy that's done it for a couple years versus and done it to a pretty high level for a couple years versus a guy that hasn't, we're absolutely breaking ties in favor of the guy that's done it. And so, for example, how that sort of shows up is I'm pretty on Kirk Cousins, right? Kirk Cousins is a guy of mine. Jared Goff is very cheap, and he's a guy that's pretty interesting to me. Matt Ryan, for example, Matthew Stafford, Russell Wilson. All those guys are going after some of the hot, flashy rookies, right? The Trey Lance, Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence guys. Heck, Tua is going ahead of some of them. And Burrow is going up out of them. And when I sort of look at that, I'm like, well, the much more likely outcome is that the veteran's going to outproduce any one of those given rookies. And that's historically, I think, the bet that I would make. So I'm avoiding the guys that haven't done it, especially when they're really expensive, Burrow and Lawrence in particular. And I'm either waiting on the position, I'm trading down, and then I'm sort of double going after some of the later guys. I think there's, typically in a typical season, I wait on quarterback. In Superflex, I sort of let my opponents take quarterbacks really early, and then I sort of nab 2 in like the top 20, right? So if it's in kind of the tier of Ryan Tannehill, Matthew Stafford, Matt Ryan, Kirk Cousins, Jared Goff, sort of in that tier, I'll sort of hit it twice or maybe 3 times if I can. This year I have been a little bit more aggressive. I'm in a startup right now where I drew 101 and didn't flinch taking Mahomes first, right? I think he's the clear-cut top asset in Superflex drafts. He might be the best Superflex quarterback we've ever seen. And, that one's an easy one, right? And then I would take Prescott after him. But then after that, I think I might actually wait on the position and sort of address it with some of those later guys like Stafford, or even Rodgers is falling right now. I think Deshaun Watson's probably worth the investment where he's going. He's got really high upside for the cost that he's going right now. So I'm typically a wait and see, because I think there's bargains, especially if you sort of do it with the profiles that I suggested, because you'll let other people make the more expensive mistakes and you can kind of get the surer things at quarterback.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Another question is from our editor, Caio, and he says, "Hey Jordan, Caio here. In a Dynasty Superflex using analytics, who is worth to start in your first round? A quarterback, running back, wide receiver, or Eli's tight end?"
Yeah, it depends on what the tight end premium stuff is. So unless the tight end premium's really high, if you're looking at I play in a lot of leagues that have two PPR for tight ends. That's probably the only time I'd consider a tight end that high. I probably, historically, so the analytics at Dynasty looks at a lot of historical data, going back years and saying, here are the trends. And I can sort of tell you that the rule of thumb historically has been you go wide receiver over running back early. This year, and that's been true for a while. It's typically true. I think this year is very different, and I don't know what to make of it. There are receiver profiles that are falling very far that historically have not fallen, and those are Mike Evans, Amari Cooper, Keenan Allen, Allen Robinson. You can sort of go through that same group of guys that are sort of in their mid to late 20s that have been really productive in their career. And like those guys are undervalued So the question is like, all right, I could go early at wide receiver, but then, all of a sudden, like I'm putting myself in a situation where I'm taking guys that are actually not not the most productive profiles. So this year, I think if you're going to go, you're getting in some of these drafts, you're seeing 11 out of the top 13 picks be quarterbacks. Like, it's just a ton of quarterbacks going early. I think you got to be selective if you're going to do that. So again, Mahomes, Prescott's a big guy that I'm in on. Feel pretty comfortable, I think, on Josh Allen. Russell Wilson's probably undervalued. Those would be the guys that I would target up there. And then, I do think there's some value in going running back early. That's typically not something that I would say. I don't like rostering a ton of wide receivers. So typically I want to get my wide receivers early when they're good and then take them, not take them later when they're not good. And that way I can take a lot of running backs in that range. So I think it's a balance between those things. Like, I don't want to wait forever on wide receivers because then I'm taking them when they're typically a lot worse than the running backs that are going in that range. And so that's kind of the balance. I think this year I'd probably go quarterback early. I'd start with probably a good quarterback in the first round. And I'd want it to be someone, again, you want it to be someone that's got a really good track record. And so that, if I'm at the late first, right, I'm going Russell Wilson, ahead of any of the guys that are young, really.
Oh, that's awesome. Makes us think that maybe we are in the right path in Startup Dynasty League that we are drafting right now with a bunch of analysts from around the world. It's an international Dynasty League that Justin Boone is organizing. We started out with 2 running backs, Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry. Then we got Ridley and Allen Robinson. And then we got our elite tight end in Darren Waller. And then we got 2 of the guys that you suggested as top 20 and the old guys, but not that old, that were Stafford and Matt Ryan. So
love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
Nice. If we have the time, we'll show you the board at the end of the show. So just, Jordan, let's talk about you as a fantasy player a little bit. Mm-hmm. Besides Dynasty, that's your specialty. What are your preferred league formats or roster structures? Do you prefer Superflex or just one QB? Do you like tight end premium? Do you like IDP, best ball leagues, whatever? What's your ideal league structure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I like anything that allows me to make more decisions. So I like bigger rosters. I like bigger lineups. I love 2 quarterback. I play in a 2 quarterback league that's actually 2 tight end, and that's probably my favorite format because it gives you a lot of different. It basically puts tight end on par with all the other positions and makes it makes you look at a lot of different players that you wouldn't ordinarily look at, right? There's 40 tight ends that instantly become more relevant that you wouldn't in a normal 12-team non-tight end premium league, you wouldn't care much about. So that's one of the things I like to do. I'm not into IDP just because if I go into IDP, like, it's going to be a deep dive I'm never going to come back from. It's the same reason I don't play Debbie. Like, it's, so that's, I don't typically play best ball. I think best ball would probably be fun, but I think I play in maybe one best ball dynasty league. But typically I like to set the lineups and do all the in-season management.
Nice.
I'm an IDP guy, and I played in a league with 5 starting tight ends last year. So God. I'm a little more bold.
Yeah.
It's really funny.
Yeah, I like where I saw the two PPR for tight ends. It actually makes a lot of guys more viable because you can flex them, right? They become much closer to the flex position. So it makes it really interesting because you can go kind of heavy at the position, and then all of a sudden you have a pretty big advantage, and are really depleting your opponents. If you go early, and often at tight end, you're really racking up a pretty big advantage at tight end over some of your opponents. So I think it's a really interesting concept when you sort of move around the baselines, and make positions more on balance, because it can really change things around.
Yeah. So getting back to statistics, I'd like to ask you, how did you view the 2020 season statistically? Of course, we have the pandemic influencing how the season panned out. But how did you view it? Was it an outlier compared to other seasons, or did you view it as equal as the other ones?
That's a good question. I think the most surprising thing, and something we're probably gonna have to grapple with, and something I think the market will probably adjust to here, and we'll sort of see this play out in drafts, in future years, is the wide receiver starting really early. So you got Justin Jefferson, for example, highlighting a young group that, CeeDee Lamb in there as well, and a whole bunch of Brandon Ayuk, a guy I really like, and they started really early and to a really high level. And you sort of look at that and you say, well, that doesn't, my big prediction was rookies are really going to struggle because they didn't have any time to prepare. Is that just random that they all did that? Is there something there in terms of, receivers don't typically start early? Is there something going on at the receiver position that, are they more pro ready? Are the systems and the pros more similar to college systems now, so they can come in easier, right? Is there something systematic that's going on, or was it just something that fluky happened? Because that's totally possible. And if you sort of made me guess, I would sort of just guess that's what the answer is, right? That it was just a fluke that these guys came in, right? They just, that they happen to be pretty decent prospects that just sort of came in all together at the same time. So, everything collided, and all of a sudden, like, they really busted out. Right? That's, I think, a possible thing. And so I think it's something we need to look at, as we sort of go forward. Are these receivers hitting earlier? And if they are, how should that influence us, right? How should that influence our decisions about the decisions we make in rookie drafts and startup drafts in existing leagues?
Nice. And following these lines, Fernando Chimbo just sent us a really interesting question. Considering the use of analytics in NFL fantasy, do you think 2020 could be considered an atypical year given all the training restrictions that occurred in relation to COVID?
So that goes along with kind of just what we said. Like, I think it's possible. I think one of the things we saw too, and I don't have the exact number off the top, but I know scoring was up, and that was actually something that, if you sort of looked at, we don't have a ton of examples where we didn't get training camp, but the other one, the most recent one, is when it was 2011 was when the lockout happened, and so you didn't really have a full training camp, and guys come back and all of a sudden scoring's up. And so, and that can be a lot of like, hey, touchdown rate's up, and some of the stuff we talked about the regression stuff, right? That can be a lot of what it was. Like, hey, guys are just missing assignments and blowing assignments, and all of a sudden what would be a 8-yard reception on a team's own 20-yard line turns into being an 82-yard touchdown, right? Like, if right, and that can really shift the things. And in a normal year, if guys are actually able to prepare and do all those things, that has a much less likelihood to happen, right? I'm open to that being an explanation, but we have seen offenses get better too, right? So that'll be the interesting thing about 2020, and then you go forward and sort of see, where is some of the yardage stuff up because teams weren't able to prepare, or is it because offenses are just getting better, right? They just have an advantages over defenses, and we're just seeing it go up and up. I think that both things are possible, and I'm not sure we can draw one direct answer from it. But I think it's I think if you're thinking that way, you're on the right track. I'm not sure there's a clear-cut answer, but I think if that's how your mind is wired, you're probably going to be pretty good at Dynasty, even if you don't have like the right answer, because you're thinking about the world in the right way.
Nice.
Hey, Jordan, to me, one of the most difficult tasks in Dynasty is to evaluate future draft picks, how to give them values, how to know how it's worth, how do you do that? And also, are you open to trading all of your picks for players to win this year and forget in the future? How do you see the draft picks?
I'm open to doing anything at any given time if the cost is right. So I typically it pains me. I mean, it pains me to trade future draft picks. It really is physically discomforting. It does not feel good. I kind of look like I have a hernia when it happens. So it's not something I typically do because I think for a lot of reasons they're undervalued. So I'm just sort of put that there. I will do it if it makes sense for example, I traded a future first round pick for Deshaun Watson, right? Like that's the right answer. Like because and then just sort of understand what a future pick is worth, right? I think the easiest way to sort of think about a future pick, is it's typically I treat them as random, because again we don't do a great job predicting in the future about finishes and those sorts of things. Some of the research I've done for the book is we over predict our own strength of our picks, for example, and then we under appreciate how good the other teams are. And so typically what I would say is like you just treat the pick as random. And the best way to sort of think about a future pick, if you're thinking about it as random, is think about it as 105. And it's not, usually you would think like, hey, random would be, in a 12-team league, it'd be between the 6th and the 7th pick. But when you sort of look at what the picks are actually worth in terms of how they produce, there's not that big of a gap between pick 11 and pick 12. Right? There can be a really, really big gap between pick 1 and pick 2, right? The difference between 1 and 3 is usually massive compared to the difference between 10 and 12. And so when you sort of look at those things, you sort of do all the math, and I laid it out in the book. The future pick is really a 105 that you sort of think about, and that typically goes like 50 overall in a startup draft. So that's one way to think about it. The other way I think about it is I won't trade. I think a general rule of thumb, I won't trade a future first round rookie pick for in a trade unless I am getting back like a top 30 player. I think that's the easiest way to think about it. And that will make you, right? Because you don't want to make those mistakes that often where you're trading a guy, you're trading future picks for guys that aren't going to be valuable long-term, right? You kind of want that player to be a part of your dynasty core going forward because that's what your pick should be aimed at. So if you're getting one, if you're trading for one, right, make sure it's a top 30 guy. Right. And I think that's a good way to think about, if you're going to make a deal, don't be including picks for guys that are outside that top 30, would sort of be my thing. And the other way to look at it is, a future pick is basically worth a win over the next 3 years. So, that's kind of what your actual number value is to it. Think about how much of a difference the player that you're trading for is going to make.
Another question, Jordan. You just traded for him, so I'm got curious. How do you see Deshaun Watson this year in the future? Do you think he plays this year, or you just traded thinking 22 and above?
Yeah, so I guess the way that I'm treating Watson is I'm just assuming that he's going to miss a year. And, if anything better happens for him as a dynasty player, put aside all the stuff he's accused of for a second. If he ends up playing more than a year that he misses, right, that's actually in my favor if I'm trading for him. But I'm just assuming that I'm losing a year. At that point, I sort of think about that and I'm like, all right, well, how does that sort of, factor in, right? Because everyone's going out, and what's fascinating to me about Dynasty right now is that everyone's going out and taking Justin Fields and taking Trey Lance and taking some of these rookie quarterbacks, right? Trevor Lawrence, and they're like, oh yeah, like this is the quarterback of the future. And then 3 rounds later, Deshaun Watson's going, right? How much realistically do we expect these quarterbacks to come in and make a big difference? Like the quarterback position's really good right now. Like this isn't years ago where we had like 5 guys and then it was everyone else wasn't very good. We had a lot of good guys and they're young, right? Like it's going to be tough to be a difference making quarterback now. Like we know Deshaun Watson is a difference making quarterback. It's only a question of if he plays, right? We don't know if Trey Lance is going to be good. We don't know if Justin Fields is going to be good. We don't know if Trevor Lawrence is going to be good or Zach Wilson, Mac Jones, right? We don't know those questions about these guys. Like we know that Deshaun Watson is good. Like if he sort of continues what he's doing for the next 10 years, he's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer, right? Like we know he's good. And so it just becomes a question about like availability. And I think, and I haven't seen anyone, which is super fascinating to me, is I haven't even seen anyone project that he's going to miss more than a year, which makes his cost totally unexplainable because people are like, like I'll take Justin Fields 2 rounds ahead of him in a startup draft. Like what reasonably do you expect Justin Fields to add over Deshaun Watson this year that's going to make him worth 2 rounds more than Deshaun Watson? Right. Because as a rookie, you shouldn't expect much. And that I think Deshaun Watson, like almost independent of what happens, right? He's probably, and I think this is something we've seen a trend of. And it's basically like once a year, there's an opportunity to get an elite core quarterback for a discount for some way, shape, or form. And I think that's something like when you get the opportunity to do it, you have to do it. And so, like, I've added a whole bunch of Deshaun Watson just because he's been really cheap. And, that's the type of thing that can really change the course of your dynasty. You think about trading for Tyreek Hill when he was going through his stuff. Like, how much has that helped you? You know what I mean? You think about trading for Dak Prescott when he was hurt. Right? You think about trading for Aaron Rodgers when he was coming off a couple of good seasons. Or a couple of disappointing seasons, and he was really, really cheap. You just think about all of those things and, the upside of that. So that's how I would view Watson. And, just another way to think about it, like, let's start in 2022 for a second. You start week 1 of 2022 through the end of their careers. Who's going to have a better career, Deshaun Watson or Trey Lance? Right? Like you probably have to take Deshaun Watson. And I like Trey Lance. Like Watson or Fields? Like you're going to take Watson, right? You should take Watson because we sort of know what he is already. And we have a really good understanding of what he is as a quarterback. We don't about these guys. And we know that it's only 40% of the top 10 picks in the NFL draft that are quarterbacks hit for multiple starter seasons, right? Like Watson's way beyond that already. And once you're way beyond that, like you're on an elite track and, to do it for a long, long time. And that's where Watson is. And, so to me, if we're going to forfeit a year, like and in a startup draft, like that's great. Like, all right, I get him in the 4th or 5th round of a startup draft right now. Like, I'll just backfill him with Tom Brady, and then we're ready to roll. You know what I mean? I'll take Tom Brady a couple rounds later, and then all of a sudden I've got like a high-end quarterback for the next decade out of those 2 guys. Like, let's do it.
Yeah.
Wow, great answer.
Thank you.
The question I entered the show today wanting to ask you the most was about rookie players and rookie picks and players, because I actually tend to think that rookie picks are overvalued by people, and you begin to say something in the opposite direction. So my question is, do you think the market is correct in the value it attributes to those assets, rookie picks and players, or is the value unbalanced? If so, how can we take advantage of that misevaluation?
Yeah, so this requires a little bit of a nuanced answer. So I think that the rookie picks themselves are undervalued. So the actual pick, right, the right to make the pick is probably undervalued for a couple of reasons. One, it's totally flexible, right? So if you want to trade it, you can trade it to almost anyone in your league, right? If you instead of having the pick, you have, I don't know, Jalen Reagor, right? There's only going to be so many people that are interested in Jalen Reagor, or, take whatever player you want. Like there's only going to be so many people that are interested in the player. The pick, it's pretty marketable. It's pretty liquid. So that's really attractive about it. 2, people underestimate how valuable the pick is, right? So it's not the middle of the round. Right? A future pick isn't worth the middle of the round. It's worth 105, right? So that's, that's about 15% in terms of, if we're getting geeky, the warp number of it's about 15% higher than people estimate it, right? You keep doing those things and they add up over time. So that's another thing. And it's security, right? The pick doesn't get hurt, right? The pick doesn't get suspended. The pick doesn't sexually harass, a massage therapist, right? It doesn't do any of those things. And so those are very valuable things. And so that's kind of how I view them as assets. Now, the rookie themselves is a different question, right? So the most valuable the pick will ever be is when you're sitting on the clock right before you make it, because once you make the pick, right, we've gone back to, hey, it's only so many people are going to be interested in this, right? Whereas if you're sitting there with the right to make the pick, there might be 3 or 4 guys wanting to trade up for the pick, targeting 3 or 4 different players, right? Like those are all things that are really possible too. So, so I have used my picks more recently. In this class in particular, I wasn't in love with the players in the class. So I had picks where I would say, all right, I would pivot off of the pick to a player, right? And so I had a mid first, and I traded the mid first for Deshaun Watson in a couple of spots, for DeAndre Swift in a couple of spots. I sort of did those deals, and it was really valuable. I generally think that if there's a skill that I'm good at in Dynasty, kind of going back to, knowing yourself, what we talked about earlier, knowing what you're good at, kind of knowing, like, I kind of know, like, exactly what a deal should look like for me to do it. And so exactly kind of what I need in return to make it work. I'm pretty good. I'm really, really comfortable with making picks making trades in rookie drafts, like whether it's trading down or trading up, getting to the right line about where I want to target somebody. So I find really high value in having picks because of those things. I think rookies generally are probably overvalued, just because people think that all their guys are going to be the next great thing, when in reality, the hit rates are lower than people anticipate, right? So I think there's a difference between having, the rookies themselves and the rookie picks, because the rookie picks give you the option to trade them. And I think that, and having future of them, like going back to the thing that, I'm big into watching like other things, right? In terms of like, how do I apply other stuff from life to Dynasty? And one of the things that we keep seeing in like the NBA, for example, we see a ton of superstars become available, and then teams make trades for them. And we basically get one of those opportunities a year for an elite guy. And maybe it's even 2, right? It's usually 1 quarterback. It's some other guys, right? It might have been Barkley last year, right? If you're constantly trading away your future picks, it's tougher to make those deals. But if you have excess picks, like it's like I was able to make a trade last year for Barkley after he got hurt for a first-round rookie pick, right? If I didn't have a first-round rookie pick, I probably couldn't have made the deal. There's all of those things, right? For Watson right now, if I can give a future first for him, like that's an incredible deal, right? Like if you don't have the future picks, or if you're stockpiling extra of them, like it makes those deals a lot easier, right? And so those are a lot of the things about rookie picks that I think the picks themselves are probably more valuable than most people use on the picks themselves are more valuable than most people actually use the pick for in terms of drafting a rookie.
Nice. For one of our last questions, Derek on our chat is asking you your opinion on the impact of the addition of one more season game fantasy-wise. Now we have 17 games instead of 16. What does this impact in Dynasty and in fantasy in general?
That's a great question, and that's similar to the other question, earlier on about how did COVID affect stuff. I don't know the answer to that, but I think again, this is the right way to be thinking about it. I think if we're being realistic, I think the injury rate on running backs probably goes up, right? You're taking more hits, and generally speaking, if you have a top 24 ADP coming into the year, like each game that you play is like a 3% odds of suffering an injury that costs you a month, basically is the math behind it. So if you're sort of thinking about that, and instead of doing that 16 times, you have to do it 17 times, right? Instead of doing it 13 times in the regular season of your dynasty league, you're doing it 14 times, right? That opens up the potential for potentially more backup starts. So that's notable. So that would be I think the key thing. If we're going to do an actionable thing, I think, I think being sharp, right? Being constantly paying attention, right? I always love bigger leagues and more draft picks and more roster spots and more lineup decisions, because it allows your opponent to make more mistakes, right? Mm-hmm. Like it allows me, right? If I think I have a really small edge, over my opponent, right? I want to make a ton of decisions versus him or her, because those small edges add up over time. That's kind of what you expanded another game, right? It's more, if you study a little bit harder than the next person, if you, read the news, if you study the stats, right? If you're listening to the analytics of Dynasty and I release, a podcast every day, right? That's 7 more podcasts that you've listened to over the course of the regular season that your opponent's not. All of those things are really, they're going to add up, right? So that would be the other thing too, is like, don't fall, I struggle with submitting waivers sometimes, right? Like I have to grind through that. Like I can't lollygag through that. I can't slog through that, because like those it's going to add up, right? It's another week that someone better than me is going to be, is going to be sniping me on the waiver wire, doing those things. So like those advantages really magnify as you sort of make the league bigger. So that would be the other thing that I would say. So I think running backs, and then I think from a personal, management perspective, like you have to keep your focus even better, because you're getting more opportunities on your opponents for them to make mistakes and you to get advantages over them.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, for our last question, what are some players that you like more or less than the consensus? Focusing more on Dynasty, maybe 1 or 2 from each of the main positions.
Yeah, Stafford is one I like a lot more. Lawrence is one that I like a lot less. So that's easy one there. I think in terms of running backs, I like Jacobs and Montgomery more than consensus. I'm probably down on Dobbins and Akers would be the 2 that I'm probably lower on than the market is. Wide receiver. Yeah, well,
yeah, that hurts.
I'm a little concerned that everyone anoints Akers a little bit, and I have some concerns about the receiving upside of Dobbins. But I think they're good players. Like I don't think they stink by any means, but I just think they're a little bit overpriced. Wide receivers, guys that I think are probably undervalued. Like there's a core guys, like generally speaking, guys that have multiple top 24 starter seasons that are less than like 29 years old are undervalued right now as like a class of them. So that's Allen Robinson, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper, Mike Evans, Brandon Cooks, right? Like those guys typically are undervalued because they're typically pretty productive profiles going forward. Some of the overvalued guys, like, I think that guys that haven't hit that go really high are concerning. I think Judy's probably a danger guy, even though he's not that expensive. I think he's pretty concerning, I think, from a value perspective. The tight end position, I think that Waller and Hawkinson are probably undervalued. I think they got a pretty good claim at being 2 of the top 3 guys at the position, and then 2 of the top 4, I guess. And then I think some of the guys that are overvalued at the position, like I think Kittle over Waller is probably. I don't like when you look at their stats and stuff. I think Waller's clearly the better player. So that would be one that I would sort of be. I think the market's kind of coming closer to that. based on my sort of reading of it. But those are really the ones that I would say. I think people thinking that Kyle Pitts is going to be, the next Rob Gronkowski, like maybe he is, but like like be careful with assuming that, because that position's really, really tough to adjust to. So,
yeah. So Sergio has one last question before our last messages.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I have 2 wishes from Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
Can you convince Rui to trade Deshaun Watson for my first round pick next year in our Superflex league, please? As you were saying, I just look around our league and to know who was the owner of Deshaun Watson, and unfortunately, I saw it was Rui. So I gave up on the idea of trading him for him.
Sorry about that.
So my second wish is I'm trying to build my projections this year for the first time, and I really wish you gave us some tips. And what is the biggest mistake someone makes when they build their projections?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that if I had to give advice on that, I don't do my own because if I'm being totally honest, I don't think I can mentally handle the stress of doing it. Like, I hate Dynasty rankings for the purpose of like it's the most like it's like the hernia pain that I talked about trading the future picks. Like, that's kind of what I look like when I'm doing rankings. So I stopped doing them. But I would say that someone that I admire quite a bit is Mike Clay from ESPN. And I just went through Mike's, he does them really, really early, and then he adjusts them or whatever. And one of the things that I went through with him is, and just looking at his was, I just looked at the target number, right? I just took the fantasy points that he projected and looked at the target number that he projected and just divided the points by the targets for the wide receivers, just because I wanted to know, like, is this about right? Because the number, right, the fantasy points per target should be around 1.65. If you're a lot higher than that, you're probably too high on the player. If you're a lot lower than that, you're probably too low on the player. So I think starting from the premise of projecting wide receivers in particular, I think you start by projecting targets, and then you sort of move there. And then, as you do your projection, you're projecting how many, receptions they get of the targets and the yards and all that, and the touchdowns. And then when you sort of come back and look at it, I think you need to have that number at or extremely, extremely close to 1.65. So that would be the first thing, 1.65 to 1.7. The other thing too is I would say at quarterback, don't have the touchdown rate very high or low, right? So, and maybe the way to do it is, I think it's fair to say that Aaron Rodgers throws for touchdowns better than, the rest of the position, right? So maybe his touchdown number, maybe it's 5%, maybe 5.5%, something like that, of his attempts are touchdowns. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. Same way on the backside of it, like even the guys that you don't think are that good, it's still probably around 4%. Right? I think that's a way to project them, so that way you don't have massive outliers. And that would sort of be the way that I would look at it in terms of that. And then I think you're really trying to get. I think you're really trying to get right in the sense of like, usage, right? If you sort of, what you're really projecting is usage, and then sort of project from there based on, some of the guidelines that I mentioned.
Well, that's awesome. Before we make our last messages, let's ask my colleagues to say their goodbyes, their thank yous, and I'll start by thank you very much, Jordan. It was really an honor to have you here with us. You gave us another masterclass on Dynasty, on the fantasy, and well, thank you so very much. And now you, Rui, our big boss, say your farewell to our great guest.
Thank you, Jordan. It was really educating. I look forward to talk to you again in many opportunities about analytics, especially, and other matters. Thank you very much.
Guys, it was really an honor to come and talk to you. So, I mean, this has been, it's really cool to sort of be talking to people from a lot farther away. That's always the thing that about the analytics of Dynasty journey that interests me. Like the fact that I have, conversations with folks at such a distance, and, I've got international subscribers and stuff like that. It's always pretty amazing to me, and that we all can come from different places and do different things, but have similar interests and come together, right? It's a pretty amazing thing. So I just, it's a really cool experience for me. I just want to thank you guys for having me on and coming to talk with you.
It sure is a truly great experience. What about you, Caio Bretas? What are your last messages for us?
Wow, man, I really like talking to you today. I thought you gave us some great lessons, really, and I really liked it. And I like to urge you, let's say, to make more of those Ask Me Anythings on Twitter. And when you do it, I'm always there, man. I'm always trying to get some information out of you and questions and answers. And
I'll tell you what, I'll do one at halftime of the NBA game tonight. How about that?
I'll be there.
All right.
So thanks, guy. Nice to talk to you.
For sure.
What about you, Sergio?
Oh, thank you, Jordan. It was really cool. If it was cool for you, just imagine for us, man. It was very, very. I learned a lot hearing from you. Thank you very much for coming here, accepting our invite. It's really, really cool when guys like you come here to talk to us.
Yeah, I mean, how about we set it up where we do it in person sometime? I'll come down and visit you guys and we can do it in person.
Oh,
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you once again, Jordan. I'll just send some last messages in Portuguese and we'll wrap it up, okay?
Sounds good.
Ok. Bom, galera, é isso aí. Mais uma live especialíssima que a gente teve. Muito obrigado por todo mundo que participou, principalmente ao Fernando Timbó, que ganhou a vaga no BRFF Bowl. Vai jogar aí com vários perfis da NFL Twitter no Brasil, com as regras do Scott Fish, bem legal. Já está com a vaga garantida aí, meu grande amigo Timbó. Alguns outros recados, as chamadas para as nossas próximas lives, a confirmada é na próxima terça-feira, dia 13 de julho, 8 horas, com o Bob Lang, ele que é do Big Guy Fantasy Sports, especialista em consistência. Então, ele não só fala sobre consistência, mas ele tem toda uma fórmula e é um conteúdo muito legal também. Não percam aí, próxima terça-feira. Quem sabe em julho também role um auction draft ao vivo aqui, um leilãozão entre a nossa equipe, vai ser no mínimo muito engraçado, alguns rounds de leilão aqui, e quem sabe a gente traz alguém aí da Copa do Mundo, da International Dynasty League do Justin Boone para conversar com a gente, e uma novidade também confirmada é que vamos lançar um podcast semanal, o Pergunte ao BRFF. Amanhã, sexta-feira, vamos lançar no Twitter e no Instagram o post para que vocês coloquem suas perguntas. Também tem o e-mail, vai estar todas as informações aí nas nossas redes sociais. E toda quarta-feira, a partir do dia 14, vamos gravar esse podcast curtinho ao estilo do J.J. Zacharyson para vocês tirarem suas dúvidas e perguntarem o que vocês quiserem sobre fantasy para a gente. É isso aí, galera. Muito obrigado, Sérgio. Muito obrigado, Rui. Muito obrigado, Bretas. Muito obrigado, Jordan. E até a próxima.